Thanks very much for your patience. My name is Peter Glasgow, and I'm Chair of the Peace Pledge Union Council. And it's a real honour for me today to be asked to chair this ceremony and to welcome you all to this event. I'd also like to thank you all for actually coming in person or joining us online. There's a number of people online this morning for our alternative remembrance ceremony, which we're holding here in front of the memorial to the conscientious objectors of all nations. Just a technical info for those joining us online. You're probably joining through the PPU website, but you can also watch on the PPU's YouTube channel. Please feel free to join in the YouTube live chat and let us know where you're watching from, please. And you can share the event on social media and tweet using the hashtags #WhitePoppies and #RememberThemAll. Okay, so whatever that means. Okay, firstly, I'd just like to spend a little time outlining the order of ceremony. I'm going to say a few words about why we are joining together here. I'll then call upon our two speakers, Rebecca Johnson and Kate Smurthwaite, who are very lucky to have with us today to speak for 10 minutes each. And I'll give them proper introductions when it's time for them to come up here. They'll be followed by a statement from the Russian Movement for Conscientious Objectors, an audio recording of Yuri Shelyashenko, a Ukrainian pacifist. We will then observe a 2-minute silence, and after that, a member of the PPU will, on behalf of the PPU, lay a wreath of white poppies. At this point, any of you who wish to come forward and lay their own wreaths or individual poppies, and if you wish to vocalise or name or names, please do so at that point. When that is completed, we'll end the ceremony with some concluding remarks, and people will then be free to go, or perhaps hopefully spend a little time mingling or networking, I believe is the phrase, whilst completing the sign-up PPU sheet. That's very important. Okay, so, well, why are we here? Well, every one of us will have personal and individual motivations for wearing a white poppy and coming here today. The Peace Pledge Union has summarised 3 main reasons for wearing a white poppy. We're here to remember all victims of war, civilians and members of armed forces from all parts of the world. We stand here to challenge militarism, something that has over the last few years been clearly on the increase, perhaps not least in our schools, our colleges and our universities. And we're here to affirm our commitment to work for a world where conflicts are resolved without violence and with justice. We wish to build a culture of peace. It is also fitting that we're gathered here at the memorial to conscientious objectors of all nations, individual men and women who in a non-violent way showed their opposition to war by refusing to be conscripted or drafted into any support for war. It's also appropriate at a time when across the world, not least in Russia and the Ukraine, people are bravely making the choice to oppose war in many different ways. We continue to resist war and militarism wherever they are found and whoever perpetuates them. The horror that we feel at the invasion of Ukraine naturally leads us also to campaign against the war in Yemen and all other wars and invasions around the world. Okay, let's now turn to our speakers. Our first speaker is Rebecca Johnson, and Rebecca is an ecofeminist peace and disarmament activist. She spent 5 years living at Greenham Common. She has since worked with the UN on international peace and justice, climate action and nuclear disarmament, and served as first president of the Nobel Peace laureate ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. This is a day of remembrance. And on the way coming here from Brighton on the train, I also I had to come face to face with recognizing the real fragility of all our lives, as a passenger on a train ahead of us was taken very seriously ill. And I just want to think about her also and all of her family. I don't know if she survived or not. I do know it was serious. I want to thank Peace Pledge Union for holding this every year and for inviting me this year. And as I mentioned to them when I received this invitation, that my mother was a member of Peace Pledge Union from the 30s. But here we are, and we are here to remember everyone killed and injured in the many ways that violence and war inflict. Yes, the soldiers, the squaddies signed into the wars off the dole queues, as has always been the case. Let's remember, in one way or another, certainly was the case with a lot of the squaddies who served at Greenham. And also because I teach every so often at the Shrivenham Defence Academy, and I always stress the roles of defence services and the myriad ways in which we could actually be utilising the skills of these young women and men who go into the military in ways that actually, from my conversations with them, they'd much prefer to be used. And we have to think about the ways in which we are going to need to have well-trained defence services helping us through all kinds of climate emergencies, of flooding and, you know, starving people. And, you know, if wars are being used ever. So these are some of the issues that I want to also recall and recognize the service that is often in the heads of those young women and men who go into what are called the armed services, but they go in because they want a training and education and also because they care about service. But I also want to really remember that for all wars, time immemorial, and we see this so clearly in Ukraine now, let's remember all the women and the children who are raped, killed, or left traumatized. We see it in Ukraine, but let's also remember Bosnia. Let's remember Rwanda. You know, Bosnia, 20,000 girls and young women were raped. Many more were killed, but many young men were massacred in those. Rwanda, 250,000 women and girls raped, and of course, you know, up to 1 million actually murdered. So war is the problem. And nuclear weapons never deterred any of the wars that have taken place since 1945. They just displaced where the killings and rapes and use of weapons were located. Afghanistan, Iraq, Darfur, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and going even further back, the Korean Peninsula, all these wars. So militarism in our lives and societies is the real problem. And so let's think about the implications of that. Climate destruction is a major consequence of militarism. The carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas emissions from all aspects of military production and use are a major part of what has led us to climate destruction that is potentially a slow death of the next generations and the whole planet. But also the increased violence against women and children, not just during the war, but through the traumatization of the people, the men who go into war, and the society. The refugees, homelessness, the money spent on not on education and health, but on weapons and war, and the ways that we memorialize and turn war into something heroic. It isn't. It's a tragedy. Recognizing the erosion of democracy and human rights, nuclear weapons at the top of the patriarchal violent structure. If a leader is willing to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, which after all is what nuclear deterrence actually means. It means it being equipped and ready and with policies that threaten the use of nuclear weapons. Leaders who are willing to do that, and societies that demand that of leaders, as we see in our society, it's crazy. This is about allowing, indeed committing, perpetuating and allowing uses of violence and force at all levels of our domestic and our foreign policy lives and actions, all in the name of so-called national security. So if war is the problem, how do we prevent war and build peace? Prevent nuclear use and tackle climate destruction. Climate chaos is going to bring about war, and war leads to this climate, us to be on the brink of climate destruction. So we need to abolish nuclear weapons, and we have the treaty to do that, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, negotiated in the UN in 2017, entered into force just last year, 2021. We have this. I was very closely involved with it. I went to the first meeting of states parties and was there as they adopted really strong declarations, a 50-point plan of action for how we implement and verify this treaty. Our job here in this country is to get our country on board. There are already 87 countries on board. We need to make it the full 191 in the UN. But also prioritize cooperative, humanitarian and environmental security above so-called national security, which actually means armed, nationalized defense. Deep cuts in production, the trade and use of armaments of all kinds, and for us to be teaching in our schools from every age, consideration for others, across all the differences and accepting the differences. Consideration, compassion, peace studies, conflict mediation. We all need to understand better how we can dial down when conflicts occur. Yes, we are going to be disagreeing on things. Conflict is a part of society, but armed conflict should never be, and therefore wars should never be. So mediation skills, human security, environmental protection, and our responsibilities for all of those. To prevent conflicts turning into catastrophic wars, but also to prevent the domestic violence and the conflicts that we see every day in our own lives. And of course, to redirect resources from military industrial so-called growth to real cooperative, sustainable, human and planetary needs. So finally, because it is a day of remembrance, and I'm standing before this plaque, I want to remember my father, Guy, who was a conscientious protector, known then as a conscientious objector in the 1930s, even as he worked in Birmingham to find homes for the kids being brought out, mostly Jewish, but not entirely, kids being brought out of Nazi Germany from 1936 onwards. He and my mother, that's how they met. And my mother, Eleanor, it was only after my father died and when I started going to Greenham Common that my mother told me that she had been a member of Peace Pledge Union as a young woman, as a teacher in Birmingham, that's how she got involved, being a conscientious protector, not just objecting, but protecting. And this is how we need to think of ourselves. And I'm so glad that the ecocide movement has, or the stop ecocide movement, I should say, has really taken up this understanding of conscientious protection. So my mum, Eleanor, my dad, Guy, and all of the relatives that some of you may have in your past who either served in the military and were killed or injured or traumatized, and maybe that spilled down into your life. But also all those who were courageous enough to stand up and say, I want to protect, I will serve people in every way I can in my life to protect, but I will not take up arms and kill anyone else. That is really why I wanted to come here, and that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a very comprehensive and passionate outline of why we're here, and very clearly expressed, and particularly having been through such a traumatic journey here. So thank you very much. You might be interested that people are still joining us online, and they're joining us from Oxfordshire, from Cambridge, from Edinburgh, from Hertfordshire, from Cornwall, from Dorset, from Inverness, from Taiwan, and also from Germany. So, we're lots of others around the world with us here this morning. Okay, our next speaker is Kate Smurthwaite, who is a secular and humanist activist. She's a comedian and writer. She performs all over the UK and internationally, and stars in the News at Kate video series, which I recommend highly. She has worked with asylum seekers through Women for Refugee Women and Women Asylum Seekers Together. She appears regularly as a panellist on television and radio shows, such as Question Time, Women's Hour, and the Jeremy Vine Show. So over to you, Kate.
Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me here. I was so touched and moved to be asked to come and speak here and to have an opportunity to participate in this ceremony of remembrance. And when I thought about it, the first thing that came to me was that remembrance is an element of grief, that what brings us all here in so many ways is grief, is that perfectly normal and natural reaction that we have when we hear about the deaths of people around the world and of people close to home. And it has come to my attention that grief these days is something that seems to have gotten very lost and very confused in our society. And I'm going to start with a little kind of anecdote. So in late 2015, I was in an aerobics class and it was interrupted. And the instructor said, "We've got to do a minute's silence. I'm not sure what for, maybe France." And I'm not judging this woman in any way because I think that she's from Lebanon and there had been attacks in Paris a few days earlier and there had been similar attacks in Lebanon a day before that. So she's quite right to be confused about what exactly it is that we were supposed to be commemorating. But nonetheless, 30 sweaty women in fluorescent lycra sat on their fold-out steps and stared into the distance. Elsewhere in the gym, people leaned against the chin-up frame or paused on the elliptical trainer, all apart from one guy with his headphones in who kept swimming in the medium clockwise lane, perhaps because he supports ISIS, I'm not sure. From the badminton court, one speaker was still running, playing some inappropriate pop song to the tune of "You Know You Want It." And then it was over and she said, "Okay, let's do bums." And the media acts as self-appointed police on this greavy train, as I call it. The then opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn faced criticism for failing to sing the national anthem loud enough and not bowing deeply enough, as though the latest edition of Debrett's How to Grieve Properly required some sort of updating. Now, it is normal, and I would argue healthy and right and human, to feel sadness and grief when we hear about deaths like these around the world, especially when they are so clearly avoidable and so clearly unnecessary and so horrendously brutal. But if we know anything about grief, it is certainly not an emotion that adheres well to a tight corporate schedule, particularly not one that slots it in directly before exercises intended to give you buns of steel. Compulsory grief is not only pointless. Looked at objectively, it is grotesque and insulting. I gain zero comfort from knowing that in the circumstances of my unfortunate death, some women in France will do less crunches. And this corporatized, nationalized, patriotized, stolen grief serves as the ultimate whitewash. The news is plastered with warmongering politicians conspicuously grieving to camera 3, while they order ill-considered drone strikes and approve arms trades with murderous regimes such as Saudi Arabia. The platitudes about families and loved ones, thoughts and prayers, and this difficult time are utterly nauseating. So I would like to invite all of us here and around the world to do grief properly. Because if you really, really think about the brutal, cruel, pointless, agonizing, vile murders of innocent people, and the only reaction it engenders in you is a willingness to stop doing aerobics for 60 seconds, I'm afraid to say there is something terribly wrong with you. Instead, we must ask the difficult questions. We must not acknowledge the unseen ways in which our actions and choices and those of the society in which we live fans the flames and funds the mechanisms of brutality. We must tear down the so-called defense industry brick by brick. We must chase down every hypocritical politician and demand they answer our questions and face the truth. We must chain ourselves to every set of railings, blockade every weapons convoy, disrupt every arms fair, and demand that every innocent family fleeing war and violence is welcomed with open, human arms and treated with respect. Otherwise, what is our grief for? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Reminding us that ultimately it's about action that we need to be taking, and the debunking, as you call it, the grieving gravy train. Thank you. Okay, we're now going to have a statement from the Russian Movement for Conscientious Objectors. But before I call upon Nadja Lovadinov, who has been working with us at this very busy time for the PPU to read this statement, I just want to say a few words about some of the PPU's position regarding the war in Ukraine, which is fully explored and expounded on our website. So if you want to get more detail of what I'm about to say, that's where you'll find it. The Peace Pledge Union stands in solidarity with peace campaigners in the Ukraine, Russia, and throughout the world who are resisting the war in the Ukraine. Condemning the invasion of Ukraine and renouncing all war, we stand against both Russian militarism and NATO militarism. The PPU condemned Putin's invasion of Ukraine as soon as it began on the 24th of February of this year. We are backing peace campaigners in Russia and Ukraine and seeking to ensure that their voices are heard in the UK. We applaud mass known cooperation by Ukrainians under Russian occupation, and support the more than 20,000 peace activists arrested by Putin's police in Russia. And as the British section of the War Resisters International, we are liaising with people around the world in our response to the war. We are challenging attempts to misuse the crisis to promote militarism, opposing calls for higher military spending that will further stir up military tension. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there's two statements I'll be reading out today. The first one is by the Russian movement of conscientious objectors, and it was written on the 25th of February of this year. And here's the following statement. What is happening in Ukraine is a war unleashed by Russia. The conscientious objectors movement condemns Russia's military aggression and calls on Russia to end the war. The conscientious objectors movement calls on the Russian servicemen not to participate in hostilities. Don't become war criminals. The conscientious objectors movement calls for all conscripts to refuse to serve in the army and to apply for alternative civilian service or to be released on medical grounds. And now the following statement was released by the feminist anti-war resistance in Russia. And this was on the 25th of February, 2022. So, Russia has declared a new war on a neighboring country, to which it left no right to self-determination and no hope for a peaceful life. This was not the first time Russia declared war. We are aware that the war has been going on for all these 8 years at the initiative of the Russian Federation, and that the war in Donbass is a consequence of the illegal annexation of Crimea. We believe that Russia and its president are not and never have been concerned about the fate of the people in Luhansk and Donetsk. And the recognition of the republics after 8 years was only needed to invade Ukraine under the guise of liberation goals. Feminism, as a political force, cannot be on the side of war, and especially the war of occupation. Feminism advocates for the development of society, helping those who are vulnerable, multiplying opportunities and prospects, as well as ensuring that there is less violence around and people coexist peacefully with each other. War means violence, poverty, forced migration, broken lives, insecurity, and the disappearance of a future. It opposes the whole essence of the feminist movement. War exacerbates gender inequality and can set back all human rights gains for many years. War brings with it not only physical violence, but also sexualized violence. As history shows, during war, for any woman, the risk of being raped increases several times. For these and many other reasons, Russian feminists and those who share feminist values need to take a strong stand against this war unleashed by the leadership of our country. The current war, as Putin addresses shows, is also under the banner of traditional values that Russia allegedly decided to carry to the world in a missionary way, using violence against all those who disagree with them or hold other views. And what these traditional values consist of is well understood by anyone who is capable of critical thinking. They are based, among other things, on the exploitation of women and the struggle against those whose way of life, self-determination, and activities go beyond the narrow patriarchal norms. Justifying the occupation of a neighboring state by the desire to carry this distorted norm and demagogic liberation to it is another reason why feminists throughout Russia must resist this war with all their might. Feminists today are one of the few active political forces in Russia. And for a long time, the authorities did not perceive us as a political movement, and therefore we were temporarily less affected by the repression than others. More than 45 feminist groups operate throughout the country, from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. We call on feminist groups and individual feminists to join the feminist anti-war resistance and join forces to fight the war and the government that started it. There are many of us, and together we can do a lot. Over the past 10 years, the feminist movement has gained enormous media and cultural power. It's time to turn it into political power. We are the opposition to war, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and militarism. We are the future, and we will win.
Thank you. We're now going to hear a recording which has been sent to us specifically for this event from the Ukraine by Yuri Shelyashenko. This will be released, a video of this will be being released on the Peace Pledge YouTube channel, and the text will also be available online. And just to say, Yuri is a Ukrainian pacifist. He's a public intellectual and legal scholar. He is executive secretary of the Ukrainian pacifist movement, which is a member of the European Bureau for Conscientious Objection, which is a section of the War Resisters International and a member of the International Peace Bureau. The speech is 8 minutes long, and the recording is coming directly from a city being attacked from someone with real depth of experience of the challenge faced by peace campaigners in the Ukraine right now.
Dear friends, I am speaking from Ukraine, where the Russian invasion took tens of thousands of lives and may take much more, because leaders by governments which failed to resolve their disagreements peacefully. This memory is related to a day of armistice, 11th November 1918, when guns were silenced in the First World War. It was probably a miracle for people who used to endless war, because even after 8 months of war in Ukraine, many of my compatriots gave up hopes for a ceasefire and peace talks. British citizens living today in relative peace can't imagine what a relief the armistice was. But you could watch a film, All Quiet on the Western Front, or read the novel of Eric Marie Remarque under the same title and understand. I wish every year during the century people recalled the horrors of war, gradually getting rid of armies and weapons, strengthening non-violent way of life and culture of peace. It would be natural to strive for the removal of all causes of war after honest commemoration of cruel and pointless bloodshed a century ago. Unfortunately, instead of a century of honest commemoration, we had a century of lies. Memories about insane great power politics which led to the World War are not welcomed at the Remembrance Day. Also, there is an informal taboo on remembering ignored voices of sanity and repressed conscientious objectors to military service. Some people still remember what a shameful carnage every war is, wearing white poppies to remember all killed lives, including civilians, not only soldiers. But most of people are told to honor heroic soldiers who gave their lives for the sake of militant nationalism and follow their example, which means to serve in army and to repeat bloodshed instead of civil resistance to systemic violence, refusal to be part of inhumane war machine, creation of peace movements able to cure societies from political and economic addiction to war. At least Remembrance Day is partially honest, because it is mourning, not a holiday. But in Russia and in Ukraine, we used to celebrate so-called Victory Day, defeat of Nazi Germany on 9th May, This started in Soviet Union with military parades on Red Square in Moscow, intended to show the deadly might and power, including nuclear weapons. No grief is allowed on these victory days, only tears of joy and triumph. And we had no peace movements daring to challenge these annual orgies of militarism. This appalled me all my life. 20 years ago, I was so desperate that I went to celebrate in streets of Kiev at Victory Day with anti-war banner. I told tens of puzzled people asking explanations that we should abolish army. I handed out flyers printed by hand on a typewriter. One paratrooper in ceremonial uniform tried to take away my banner, but I held it high and he failed. I brought the banner to eternal flame and left it there. Later, I realized I was lucky that police didn't arrest me, and it was the first public peace action in my life. Before that, I had only experience of reading anti-war poem to a recruiting officer when I was called for compulsory pre-conscription registration. Yeah, conscription. The United Kingdom was lucky to get rid of it, but we still have it. Conscription continued after the World War II because generals were allowed to celebrate this Victory Day. They were allowed to teach children there will be always a cause to die for fatherland, because supposedly there is no problem in war, all blame must be put on evil enemies and dictators with whom you can't negotiate, and shut up traitor if you think you can. We live in a mad world which prepares for war and wage wars all the time. Populists in charge can't live without the glory and power of war. And the military-industrial complex, always hungry for profits, turned our economies into snakes eating their own tails, like mythical monster Ouroboros. Citizens of developed countries used to think they live in peace, but there are tens of wars in the world today. And this Third World War, I mean permanent war in and against so-called Third World countries waged by the great powers, was never stopped after the formal end of the Second World War. Now the mainstream media are preparing us to tighten our belts, dress warmly, and prepare to fight for victory in World War III between the West, Russia, and China. Their contempt to our common sense is so arrogant that warmongering pundits are teaching us how to survive nuclear war, as if we seriously can do it. In fact, we can. We can't survive nuclear war. And furthermore, every nuclear warhead, even not exploded, but only added to vast arsenals stockpiled, produced nuclear warhead kills people by hunger and deprivation of means of living. I would never wear a red poppy simply because it resembles nuclear mushroom. We must ban nukes and take seriously obligations to resolve disputes by diplomacy instead of mass murder. There is no good in any war. That is a thing which we must remember today. So let's pray for a ceasefire in all wars in the world, for a great peace talks, so fair and inclusive, that could bring to humankind a new social contract based on the abolition of war. And I would like to end my speech with a quote from a last poem of Ukrainian writer and activist Ivan Franko, which expresses his best wish shortly before his death during the First World War. Clean skies are proudly azure. when bloodshed of inhuman war is ceased and peace endure.
Rather refreshing, I think, to get a rather different take on the views in the Ukraine than what we're bombarded with by our media. Okay, we will now observe a 2-minute silence. Okay, thank you. We'll now be at the point where we will be laying our wreaths on the stone here, and if people, as I said before, wish to come up and lay individual poppies, then please, this is the time to do that. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm now just going to make a few concluding remarks. First of all, I just want to sort of compare, in a sense, what we're doing here and in the name of peace to what happens elsewhere. We aren't, unlike what's going on at Whitehall, surrounded by the trappings of militarism. We are not, and we do not glorify war. We, as our speakers have attested, all of them, are not about the past, we're about the future. And it's worth remembering that it was the women who had lost mothers, fathers, partners, sons, daughters, and other loved ones in the carnage of the First World War who came together in 1933 in the Women's Cooperative Guild to produce white poppies to represent remembrance of all victims of war. Ours, I think it's fair to say, is the true voice of remembrance. I'd like to... Okay, can I just take the opportunity of thanking all those involved in organising this event. In particular, thanks are owed to Jeff Tibbs, our Remembrance project manager, who's done an absolutely fantastic job alongside our other staff, Simon, Jonathan, and Nadja, in promoting the whole White Poppy campaign. So thanks for that. I'd like to thank you all again for coming here, and also for those watching online. It's perhaps worth noting that the whole ceremony is now available to watch online, so please feel free to share it. Could I also take the opportunity to encourage people to continue to keep in touch with us at the PPU, so that we can be working, as we have been talking about, working together for peace throughout the year. If you contact us, we can share ideas about how to get involved, how we can all get involved. But perhaps even more importantly, we would like to hear about your ideas for future action and activities. Thank you. As I said earlier, I'd like to encourage people to stay and mingle or network after this event. So thanks again. Thank you.